Decatur Book Festival is a non-profit. It depends on sponsors and donations to great authors to Decatur each year. Please consider a tax-deductible donation to support the festival by going to the festival website. Lastly, please take a moment to ensure all of the device ringtones are turned off. Now, please welcome our panelists. Today we have moderating the talk, Jill Evans. Jill is the president emerita of the Atlanta Writers Club and a trustee of the Carnegie Library in Newman, Georgia. She loves art, architecture, and history and writes fiction, both contemporary and historical. Carolyn Curry is our award-winning author, historian, and founder of the nonprofit Women Alone Together. Her book, Suffer and Grow Strong, The Life of Ella Gertrude Clayton Thomas, was selected one of the books all Georgians should read, and Curry received Georgia Author of the Year Award from the Georgia Writers Association. Sarah McCoy is the New York Times, USA Today, and internationally best-selling author of the novels Mustic Island, Marilla of Green Gables, The Map Maker's Children, The Baker's Daughter, and The Time It Snowed in Puerto Rico. Stacia Pelletier is the author of Accidents of Providence and The Half-Wives, both shortlisted for the Townsend Prize. Our final author is Kristina McMorris. She is the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today best-selling author of 2 novellas and 8 historical novels, including the million-copy bestseller, Sold on a Monday. She is a recipient of more than 20 national literary awards. Please give a warm welcome to our panelists.
Thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's so exciting. Decatur Book Festival is 20 years old. This is an amazing event. Thank you for coming out in the morning. Is everybody well caffeinated and ready to go? This is great. Okay, so I want to get right into it, and I want to go across really quickly and have them just give a sentence or two about what their book is about and who their main characters are. So just a really brief introduction to your book. So we'll start. Go ahead.
Okay. So this is, the story of a young, beautiful, girl who wants to become an actress, and then she does. And once she hits the peak of, the world's acclaim, she leaves it all behind at the early age of 21 and goes and joins a Benedictine abbey in Connecticut. And it's the story of why and how. And her name is Lori Lovely. Whatever happened to Lori Lovely?
Christina.
Can I grab my book from you?
She was carrying around my book. It was awesome. So, it matches my dress. So not on purpose, but there you go. So it'll be easy to find on the table. So The Girls of Good Fortune is my 8th novel. It begins in Portland, Oregon, where I'm from. I say the other Portland on the other side of the world. In 1888, when a woman awakens in an underground cell, drugged and disguised. She has no idea how and why she got there. She only knows that she is in the so-called Shanghai tunnels under downtown Portland. And as her memories start floating back to her, she starts piecing together the path that led to her abduction, and she realizes she left behind a child in peril. So it's going to take all of her creative and adaptive skills, especially as a half-Asian woman passing as white during an extremely anti-Chinese time, in order to not just hopefully survive, but also make it back to those she loves in time.
Okay, Carolyn.
Okay. My book, Trudy's Awakening, is about 3 women who actually lived in Georgia in the late 19th century. One, Trudy, was a slaveholder. Amanda was a woman enslaved to her family. And the third woman is a young artist who's only 26 years old who is painting a portrait of Miss Trudy. All of them face horrific loss, and they have to fight their way back in a culture that is trying to deny them their dreams. But in the end, they will help each other. And that's really what we're all about, women helping women. Thank you.
Stacia.
Great. This is my newest book, The Deliverance of Barker McRae. And in case you couldn't guess, Barker McRae is the main character. She is a 14-year-old girl living in Watkinsville, Georgia in 1833. And one day a stranger comes to the farm and announces that she's won 40 acres in Georgia's Gold Lands Lottery. And that arrival and announcement sets off a chain of events, an unimaginable act of violence, and suddenly Barker finds herself on the run in frontier Georgia in the years immediately prior to the Cherokee removal and the Trail of Tears. So Barker's our main character, but we've got a lot of other stuff going on, and it's researched against the backdrop of our own state and a piece of our state's history that we often don't talk about.
So I want to ask, and I'm going to start with Carolyn, why historical fiction? Why did you want to write historical fiction? Because Carolyn, you have actually written a historical book about Gertrude before. Yes. So why did you want to come back to her with historical fiction? What drew you to that?
Well, I started out as a true historian, and you know, my first book had 450 footnotes and a long bibliography, and I worked about 10 years on that book, and I love it, and I'm very proud of it. But my second book was a murder mystery set in the world of football. Weird. And then my third book is in a completely new genre, historical fiction. My granddaughters were not very interested in reading my book with 450 footnotes. And even some adults were not particularly interested in it. But I wanted it to be very readable. And I had a friend who suggested, why don't you have Trudy, Gertrude becomes Trudy in this book, tell her story to the young portrait artist while she's painting, because her story is so unbelievable. So that's where I initially got the idea. And I had to learn to write fiction because I was a nonfiction writer. Nonfiction writers they tell you. Fiction writers show you. And I had to learn to show you. But I found out it was great fun, and you could make things up. And I could never do that in history. So it's been fun, and I have really loved it. Thank you.
Okay, so Stacia, why historical fiction for you?
Yeah, I'll build on that. I was trained as a historian also, and when I was finishing up my dissertation, I was so sick of having to get everything exactly footnoted and everything else. My imagination was just going crazy. So I said, if I ever finish this degree, I'm going to write a novel. And then I did, and I used a lot of the research I had done to write my first novel. I've always found that if you can integrate historical research, what really happened, the facts on the ground, with imagination and a powerful story, you get the best of both worlds. And also, I like to write about interior lives. I live in my head, as writers do, so the only way you can really do that well is through fiction.
Kristina?
Yeah. Well, for me, I started writing. I was an accidental author, never planned to write a novel, but I was inspired by my grandparents' World War II courtship letters. And when my grandma pulled those out and said, would you like to see the letters? Because I didn't know they'd only dated twice during World War II, exchanged letters the whole time. He came home and proposed. He was a Navy signalman on a destroyer escort during the war. They got married, were married for 50 years until he passed away. And so it seemed like a trick question when she asked, would you like to see the letters? And it's like, why, Grandma? Why would I want to see those? So yeah, of course. And little did I know it was going to change the course of my life, and that I was inspired to write then a love story about a letter exchange. And it was like The Notebook meets Saving Private Ryan. And I thought Steven Spielberg would love this. And so yes, blissfully ignorant before World War II was even a thing, when I was getting rejection letters that said World War II will never sell. I still have those letters and I pet them on occasion. So anyway, and since then, in short, the answer is that I still love to take a nugget of history that I think, how did I not know this? Everybody needs to know this. And then I love to wrap it in a story. I call it literary Advil. And that you get a sugar coating of a story on the outside, and hopefully you don't realize how much good stuff in history you get on the inside until it's over. And you think, I actually learned a lot too. And with historical fiction versus nonfiction, I think you also get to combine different parts of history that you otherwise couldn't combine into one story.
Sarah?
These are such good answers. First off, I love listening to other authors and hearing about their creative process. And in this book, Whatever Happened to Lori Lovely, it's a dual narrative. So there's the historical and then there's a contemporary. And I do that in all of my books initially come out like that. So if any of my books aren't a dual narrative, it's because my editor had me rip out the contemporary and throw it away. And I do. I'm open to that, but that's how my imagination and creative process always comes to me, is in a dual narrative of the historical and the contemporary. So in this book, the contemporary character is named Lou Tibbet, and she's actually a history major. So I'm looking at these two like, yes. So I got to sort of live vicariously through this history major there. And for me, why historical fiction? I think it's much more personal. It's my very first memories are of sitting around in my kitchen with my grandma, my abuelita, and my titis, my aunts, and my mom, and listening to oral history, storytelling, to listening to say, how did you make this sofrito? I have my Boricua reader in the front row right now, and Boricua is just another name for Puerto Rican. And so they would say, how do you make the sofrito? How do you make this? Oh, well, my mother did this and this, and it comes from the time when we traveled this. And suddenly I'm in the kitchen listening to these stories. I'm sure all of you have that experience too in some way, listening to the stories, but not just hearing about the history, then having it reflect into my present, having it then not just a story or I read or heard or someone told me about way back then. I'm now eating that history. I'm now adding to that. I'm now reflecting that past in my present life. And so I grew up hearing that, and I grew up doing that. And I think that then translated into my own writing, in that I write the contemporary and the historical back and forth, because I want contemporary characters and you, the modern readers who are living through that contemporary character, to say, okay, how does this bit of history reflect in my right now? That's the most important part for me in reading, is not just a fairy story or not just a story of long ago, but how does this still relate to me in this moment? And how can it change how I think and what I do and the people I'm around in this moment, even though it was a story about back then? That's the power of historical fiction. That's the reason I love writing it.
Okay, so one of the things that I observed in all of their books as I was reading them is that the characters have a strong sense of justice, and it runs through the storylines and the characters. And so, Kristina, I want to start with you, because I felt like Celia is running into danger when I wanted her to run away from danger. I was saying, no, don't do that. So anyway, what drives a sense of justice for your characters and for your story?
Yeah, it's not a horror genre, by the way.
No.
Don't open the door. Don't go in the basement. Yeah, so
it is October, so that could sell well. It could sell. I'm like, girl, don't down yourself. Let it sell.
Did I mention that it is a Halloween story?
Totally terrifying, horrifying. You want this right now? I'll hype my girl. I'll do it.
We've been friends for a long time, you can tell. We support each other. So what kind of drives my characters for justice?
Their sense of justice.
So I love writing about characters who that are good people. I like those characters. I know that you don't have to have that for protagonists, that it's someone who's likable as long as they are compelling. I personally, because as a reader, my favorites are the characters that I want to root for. So I love flawed, good people in my stories who very often even lose their way as far as their moral compass goes and find their way back. So that's a lot of my major characters. Celia in this case, because of her circumstances, like I said, being she's half Chinese during an extremely anti-Chinese time. And so it brings up a lot of questions for her of identity and culture and the true meaning of family, since she is masquerading as passing as white. And so because of that, there is guilt that is involved. And so she is trying to find her place in life. I remember as myself, I'm half Japanese, half Irish. So we equally respect sake and whiskey in our house. My kids figured out very early on to say that they are a quarter ninja. And I'm like, oh, why didn't I think of that as a kid? And so because of that, I can definitely relate to her. And with this story, as far as the justice goes, there were a couple atrocities that I came across as I was researching. I'll only mention very briefly. One is called the Rock Springs Massacre in Wyoming, and the other is the Hells Canyon Massacre in Oregon, northeastern Oregon, in Deep Creek. Both of these have been completely brushed under a rug and purposefully tried to be hidden from history for obvious reasons once you understand what they were about. Essentially, one of them is like the Tulsa Massacre against the Chinese. The fact that we haven't heard about it, largely about it before, with a mob burning down Chinatown in the middle of broad daylight, 28 people murdered, 15 that were injured, and no person from the mob would come forward and testify, and no Chinese person was legally allowed to testify. So no one was held accountable. So these are the kind of things that I come across, and I could not help but incorporate that into the story in a way that is personal to the character. And because of that, there is a driving force for justice that is threaded, but even just on a human level that goes beyond ethnicities.
Carolyn, justice.
Justice. Well, we're hearing about these massacres that we've not heard of. Everybody here has heard of the Civil War, and it was fought here on our ground, and we talk about it all the time. But we don't remember the women and what happened to the women during the war, and that's my concentration. And my main characters are questioning the system that they live in. Gertrude, as a young girl, started keeping a journal when she was only 14, and she kept it for 41 years. And if you read that journal, which I pored over for years, she's asking questions. She's asking about slavery. She's asking about why they have these verses in the Bible that the owners are justifying slavery. She questions the position of women. So she's looking at the justice in the system. Then Amanda, the enslaved woman, is wanting to be free, and she's looking at the institution of slavery from a different perspective. But these two women have an unusual bond, and they share and they talk, and that's really what I wanted to get into. And we have, as we say, people keep fighting the Civil War, and we keep examining these issues that are right around us. And it's about survival in this system of justice. It's a theme in Southern literature. Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind. Caroline Miller, if you remember, the first Georgia woman to win a Pulitzer in 1934. It's the injustice of the system. And these women are fighting it and trying to survive when everything really is going against them. But amazingly, these women do survive, and they make a real statement.
Stacia?
Oh gosh, these are great responses, and I could go on about justice for a while. I just make 2 points. To take one, I approach my characters always not only from as a historian, but also as somebody who went to seminary years ago, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, and who is deeply, deeply still to this day concerned and interested in questions of how our faith informs what our moral choices are. So in the case of Barker McRae, the question against the giveaway of the Cherokee lands is, what does it mean for an individual, somebody like you or me, to make a moral choice in the midst of a profoundly immoral historical moment, when the issue is so big that everybody can say, well, it's not my fault that these lands are being given away. It's not my fault that this is happening. I'm only one small part of it. What does it then mean to do the right thing? And that informs Barbara's quest. That informs the quest of the old Vermont lottery messenger who is assigned to try to take care of her. And that informs each character's sort of understanding. In a broader sense, I think I approach my work just trying to understand the inside out if you're a person of faith or if you struggle with questions of spirituality, how does that shape how you live in the everyday life? And we each are asking that question of ourselves. So it has been in my characters. Justice is linked to faith.
Sarah?
Well, I could not have gone after anyone more perfect. I mean, my book is about a nun. Yes, justice is linked. Your last statement was perfect. Justice is linked to faith. And in this book, I'm not Catholic, by the way, and I tell every audience, so I see a bunch of faces in here who've been in many other audiences with me. And I just want to be transparent. I'm not Catholic at all. And in 2016, I started a pen pal relationship with a nun in a cloistered abbey who was once a Hollywood actress. She was Elvis's first on-screen kiss. She was rumored to have an affair with him off-screen during this, or a romance with him. And I started to write with her and to find out what, just to understand her. And we developed a friendship. And then it wasn't until 3 years ago. So that was 2016. And 3 years ago, I started to write this book. And she has taught me, she's alive. This inspiration, one of the inspirations for this book, she's still alive. She's 86 years old. Her name is Mother Dolores Hart. And she has showed me how to not just talk the talk of justice and faith and hope and joy, but to actually live it. And by living it, you have to embrace everything. You have to open yourself up to being, to receiving what other people are speaking, what other people are believing, what other people are, wanting to discuss. And so that's something in this book that I absolutely tackle is, what is the truth and how is that link to faith and spirituality? But more so, how do we each sort of create our own truths in our own history, in our own life by telling what we want other people to hear or by holding back what we don't want them to hear. And so that sort of we always hear about justice and history and justice and truth and all that, but what does that actually mean? And that's something that all the characters are battling with. It's a cat and mouse game between Lou in the contemporary world, who's trying to get the truth from her aunt, Lori Lovely, and Lori Lovely telling her history, wanting to give little tidbits of the mystery of what led her to the cloistered nunnery without giving away everything of herself. And so how does that relate to justice?
Okay, so kind of a off-the-wall fun question. What was the most fun, harrowing, surprising thing that you found in your research, and maybe even something that didn't make it into the book, but something that you found in your research?
Wow.
You might have to think about that for a second. Stacia.
I'm saying this because my husband's smiling at me in the front row because he knows what he wants me to say. So I'm saying, in my research into North Georgia's backcountry history in the 19th century, it was a frontier. It was sort of the Wild West here, and there was apparently quite a robust history of fighting that was known as gouging. And as I was researching more and more, it became clear to me that one of the ways that backwoods frontier fighters would beat each other would be to gouge the other's eye out. So at first I'm like, no, this didn't really happen. But then I was going through the primary source material, and sure enough, there were articles and there were reports. And one report said that after there was one sort of tavern brawl that got a little rowdy, the next morning the children were having to go around the tavern to clean up with saucers to pick up the eyeballs that were on the floor. So that's part of our Georgian history. And it made its way into my novel in a certain way. So that was probably the weird.
Okay. We've got the harrowing part down. Anybody else with something surprising fun? Made it or didn't make it? Kristina.
Let's see here. So fascinating about the Shanghai tunnels. Are any of you familiar with the Shanghai tunnels in Portland? Okay, especially on this coast. It's pretty amazing. So it's a labyrinth of tunnels that used to exist, largely concentrated under Chinatown, and the ships would come in and they would be below street level. So very efficiently, you could go through the tunnels and drop off all your goods at all the basements. However, it could also be used for a lot of nefarious purposes, as you can imagine back then, with brothels, which were not allowed, but you could be a seamstress, by the way. You just mended trousers all day long. So they're brothels, they're saloons, etc. And what would happen is a sailor would come into port, nobody would know who he was, and he would go into a corrupt saloon, drink some ale that was laced with what they called knockout drops. And next thing you know, he could be dropped through a trap door, allegedly, right into a cell or into a cart that they would roll straight through the tunnels, right very efficiently onto the ship. Wake up at sea, and you're told that you've been sold to the captain that was shorthanded for upwards of $50 a head. A lot of money back then, and they were told you have to work for free now, round trip, all the way to a place as far away as Shanghai and back, hence the term being shanghaied or kidnapped. Now you know where it comes from. You learned something today. Aren't you glad you came? You got your money's worth. So, and the other option was to refuse and be tossed overboard. And this was called being shanghaied or being crimped back then, and I found it absolutely fascinating. And so, of course, it becomes a major part of my story.
Carolyn?
Wow. I have lived with my characters for so many years that it's hard for me to find anything that surprises me. And I talk about women having babies back in that century and how they would have babies all the time. You would be pregnant your entire life. Your entire childbearing years, you were to be fruitful and multiply. So women would have 10, 11, 12 babies, and then you would have maybe half of them die. But the women never got used to that, and the treatments that they gave the babies were so astounding. And I guess the most shocking thing that I learned was that they would blister babies, and they would put hot plasters on them, thinking they were burning the fever out of them. And I thought, oh my gosh. And my character could not stay in the room as they blistered her baby and left the room. And sure enough, the baby died the next day. Babies would get a fever, and then they would die in a day or two. And it was just so heart-wrenching. And this is the way women lived. And I tell young women today, they get excited when they get pregnant. Back then, women dreaded it and feared it and talked of it as a sickness. And they were afraid of it. And you can certainly understand that when you study pregnancies of women in that time. So be glad you live in this century when you have antibiotics and penicillin and
Epidurals.
Yeah.
Sarah?
Well, speaking of how women lived, I assumed with all my correspondences with Mother Dolores in the cloistered abbey, the Benedictine Abbey in Connecticut, that they take vows to cut themselves off. I mean, I'm not sure how many of you know very much about the Benedictines, but they cut themselves off from all the public. They shut the doors. They live behind closed doors. And so I had been letter writing with Mother Dolores, and I could call the Abbey at the portress line. And then there was someone who was assigned to pick that up, like for a certain hours a day. So these are the only ways of communication. And I just assumed that they lived kind of like medieval monks, like they're still wearing the garb, and they do kind of farm to table, and that they raise all their own chickens and cows, and they slaughter them, and they use all the meat, and they grow. So this is my assumption, right? So in 2023, I finally decided to go to it's in a town called, every time I start to say it, I kind of step back, but it's in a town called Bethlehem, and I'm not making that up. That really is the town. And so I was going up to Bethlehem to visit the nun, and I got in assuming that it would be, again, medieval, right? That's the assumption. I got in, I'm like, oh, it's so great and they're in the garb and everything. And Mother Dolores pulls out a cell phone. They all have cell phones. They have internet, they have cell phones, they have Wi-Fi. They just redid the entire internal area of the Abbey. I mean, it's like something out of like Southern Living, it's like beams and everything. Amazing. These women live amazing lives. So that super surprised me. And also that the women who greeted me were younger than me. They were like late 20s. Again, I assumed that this order, and I guess I wrongfully assumed that nuns and sisters, especially cloistered ones, lived like medieval, first off, and that they were all old. Like Mother Dolores, I have to say, I feel bad now because she's 86. I thought they were all old. Young women choosing this life. Right now, powerful. There were women I met back there with PhDs in biology who created their own bacteria so they could put it on cheese. And now that cheese is award-winning cheese in New England. Like things that just blew my mind that these women are doing, and they're doing them right now. And that, again, the history and the contemporary meet for me there. So that was super surprising. All of that went into the book. I wanted to pay honor and give respect to the sisterhood in all the contemporary chapters in which they're featured in 1990. That's contemporary in this. That I didn't write them as the stereotype, right? I wrote them as what they are now, modern and strong and doing things in the world, just not needing that acclaim of Instagram, 1 million likes. So.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the other things that I found through all of the books was grace. And I want to start with Stacia because at one point Higginbotham says, if you fancy being a lady preacher one day, you'll do well to start with grace. And I found that to be very poignant. And so talk about grace in your story and easy question.
I know these are hard questions, I have to say.
Yes, well, the scene that you mentioned, Higginbottom, who's 64 years old, he's from Vermont. He is dying to get out of Georgia and get back home, but he's stuck there, and he's stuck basically babysitting a 14-year-old girl who wants to be a preacher and who talks back to him constantly. He tells her that if she wants to be a preacher, she needs to consider grace, because she has been telling him that he drinks too much. Because he has a little flask along their adventures, and he keeps nipping from it, and she doesn't like a drinker. It's a lighthearted moment in the story, but I think the larger point for the two of them, and then for me as a writer, is that if you can approach your characters, or if you can approach your interactions with others, your relationship with others, genuinely looking for the best and the humanity in the other person, you're going to wind up with a story that people are drawn to, that has a warmth to it. And you're also going to wind up with a conversation with others where you feel you sense that other person's humanity, and you can't simply objectify them or write them off as your X or your Y. And I think especially right now in this world we're living in, this country we're living in, the capacity to approach any person you encounter with the grace and generosity that says, I don't know who you are, and I'm not going to make presumptions, and I know who I am, and I know I'm flawed, is needed more than ever. And I try to infuse that in all of my books and my writing, because it's the world I want to inhabit, so therefore I write it into the world I create.
Mm-hmm. Carolyn?
Well, that's what I want to say in this book too, because I think we have such rigid lines along race, and we have suffered with race so much in our history. And what I wanted to show, that there are different situations and there were bonds. There were relationship between black and white that were meaningful. And that's what we have between Trudy and Amanda that developed. And then there were evil people who wanted to, later in the book, want to lynch, Amanda's husband. And so we have the evil people, but we have the good people too. And I think we need to look at both sides and see all kinds of people and be open to how they feel. And I tried to show that too. Everybody's not all good or all evil. And that really goes throughout my book. And see, my title, Trudy's Awakening, she goes from being raised in a racist society, and she comes to feel that slavery was immoral, and she's willing to say it. And she did say it in her journal when very few people in the late 19th century that were former slave owners said slavery had been wrong and it had been immoral. And she was also able to change her mind about the position of women so that she became president of the Georgia Women's Suffrage Association when it was radical. And she could stand up in 1899 and say, woman was not taken from the head of man. She's not his superior. Woman was not taken from the foot of man. She's not his inferior. But woman was taken from the side of man, and there she should stand is equal in the work of the world. And that's in 1899, 21 years before the vote. So you see, being able to see things, everybody else thought it was so radical that women should even vote. They were too emotional. You know, their husbands would take care of them. And we've got to look at that because we've got things going on in our culture now about race and the position of women. And we've got to be very serious about it and look at all sides. Be honest and be open.
Kristina?
So with mine, probably one of my favorite characters in the story. Her name's Madame Marie, you know, a head seamstress. And she's modeled after two of my favorite Japanese aunties, and specifically one of them named Shizu-chan. She is what I consider the teacher who doesn't give A's. You all know this person. Tough exterior, warm heart, and it takes time and you've got to earn it, but once you're in there for life. I think that she's one of the characters in the story that has an enormous amount of grace when you figure out really who she is. And when you asked earlier, I'll add on to it when you said, why, oh my gosh, Celia's running toward the danger. There's obviously some, a naive character, a woman 19 years old in the beginning of the story in 1800. So that plays into it. But she also, where the grace and the forgiveness comes in, I think, is that she's someone who her family is wronged. And yet instead of being bitter and angry about it, she ends up trying to channel that into something positive to help strangers, people that she doesn't know. And that comes back to the justice.
Yeah. Sarah?
I actually have a chapter called The Library of Grace, and it is a contemporary chapter. And in it, the Library of Grace is Lori Lovely's trunk that the nuns are allowed to keep one sort of trunk of all their before life belongings. And so in that trunk, Lou goes in to find her aunt's history is in a Library of Grace trunk. And so it's a critical component to both the characters' journeys. Lou in discovering why her aunt went to the Abbey. That I don't want to give anything away. I'm trying to be very careful right now. Why she went to the Abbey. She has to also in that develop her own grace for her aunt, for the things her aunt did, for the choices that she made. And then at the end, she then has to not only decide how do I then approach the knowledge I have towards my aunt, but how it relates to me too. In a similar way, Lori Lovely comes through so much, and she is battling with how much grace do I give myself? And I think that's something that we all battle with every single day. How much grace do I give myself, and how much grace do I give the people around you? And in essence, she learns this, and I learned this as an author, that it's the amount of grace that you give yourself just overflows to other people. So if you pour into yourself, that is what's going to come out to other people. If you hold back from yourself, there won't be enough to give to other people. So those are the lessons I think during the writing of this. It's such a meta book for me. This was such a passion project because the characters that you read about, the things that they go through and the lessons they learn and the feelings, that's what I want. There's history. And I honor and I wanted to do justice to history, but really there's feelings. And that's what you remember about history, right? Is the feelings you have through those characters. And so I think that grace is a feeling that weaves together all the different facts and the fiction. And I hope that's what readers come away with when they close the book, is that grace.
I think we've got time for one more question before we go to audience questions. So, Sarah, at one point you have Lou, who is our contemporary character. She's interviewing her aunt, and she wants to ask her the juicy questions. And she thinks to herself, legit history shouldn't be gossip, even if the gossip was more fun to read. But I want to know from you authors, what do you think about gossip and historical fiction?
Want me to go?
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I think that a lot of times the gossip, like think about our contemporary world, our present world, all the headlines on tabloids, that's the stuff that people in the future are going to look back on and read and say, oh, that was history. What? You know, I mean, we're all into Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban. Why are they getting divorced right now? You know, it's all over our feeds on TikTok. But is that the actual history of today? Not really. That's the gossip. But that's part of our history. It is, and it isn't. And so that's the cat and mouse game I talked about earlier. Like, what are we embracing as history? What do Lou and Lori tell? And why do they tell whatever that story is about their past or about their present or whatever? And it's to get a reaction, and it's to get what's going on. And so I think gossip is integral, and yet to all history, and particularly to historical fiction. But I also think that it's something that we need to be aware that this is fiction. We need to be in our own worlds too. Like, I think there needs to be some element of us taking a step back and saying, how much of this is gossip, which is a form kind of fiction? Because how much of our own past do we actually remember? If someone asked you right now, what was it like on the day you were born? I have a story. My mom's told me a story. My dad has too. That's a story, but that's my history. But was I there to actually experience it? No. I mean, like, do I remember it perfectly? Not really. I'm making up kind of a story as I tell you. So all that is something that I want readers to think about as they read all my fiction, but particularly whatever happened to Lori Lovely, because it's a question. The title is a question. It's a gossip. Whatever happened to Lori Lovely? Well, here's what the world said, the tabloids. Here's what Lori Lovely says, and where's the truth?
Yeah. Carolyn.
I feel very strongly about this topic because as a historian, we're living in a world of fake news, and you can call it gossip sometime. And then people just making things up that are detrimental to our country. And it just drives me crazy as a historian. And also people looking back and telling you what our history is, and they don't know our history. And we're not teaching our history. And
Revisionary history.
I'm very, very concerned about that. So we've got to we've got to teach our children how to think and how to be able to tell the difference between propaganda and truth, or gossip and truth. And it's so important in this day and age because our whole country has been built on certain standards, and we're losing them. We're losing them big time, and it's our responsibility to do something about it. And we've got to speak the truth, and we've got to teach the truth, and we've got to be able to talk with one another when we have different opinions. And whether it's gossip or fake news or whatever it is, we've got to talk about it and be honest.
Kristina?
So on the flip side of the positive, I'll do a positive on what we call gossip too within families, is that in The Girls of Good Fortune, the whole book begins with, and I'm sorry, I'm going to destroy this word, the pronunciation in Chinese, but it starts with the word ping shu. And what it is the art of storytelling, specifically also in families, to pass along your identity and your culture and your lineage. So on the West Coast, we're so close to Hawaii, we call that talk story. So if you've heard that before, and any of you who are Irish know that our stories get better every time we tell them. So in that way, it is like gossip through our families. And I think the positive spin of that, versus the opposite, the negative, is that in our families, how important it is that my grandmother passed along her story of her courtship, et cetera, and how that impacts our lives present day. And so I'd say it is really important to pass those stories along. And in The Girls of Good Fortune, obviously, the whole story is told as Chinese family lore. So that specifically is how those adventures gain speed. And what my grandmother called in her recipes bagash and bagali. She said she never measured. It was all bagash and bagali. And that's the spices that we add in our family history that I think is also just very beautiful.
Stacia?
I agree with all of my peers up here, but I guess I would just add, the only point I would add is when we think about how we define gossip, I think that's important. And gossip typically has been genderized. So women gossip, men share opinions. So when you think about it, one additional way to think about gossip is a way of sharing important information by those who lack power in conventional arenas of power. So sometimes gossip is actually an empowering and liberating mechanism. It depends on how we define it. I still agree very much with Carolyn. If we're going to talk about propaganda and fake news, that's an entirely different conversation. But just remember that women are also are always told that they're the gossips, and I think that's telling.
All right, are we ready to take some audience questions? I think, okay. So do you want people to come to the mic? Yes. Okay, so if you have a question and you want to come on up to the mic, and if we don't, I'll just keep asking questions. Come on. There we go.
Hey, how are you? I'm Kristina with a K too. In right now, because I know like for work, I can use ChatGPT and other AI stuff for getting information. I'm just curious how I'm sure it's speeding up your work process a little bit, but then you probably still have to do your own due diligence of research. So how is like current gathering of information and how you originally maybe started in your work? How has that changed, or like how is it simplifying your life? I don't know. Just your thoughts on it in general is what I'm wondering.
Anybody want to address AI?
Be really careful. Our daughter teaches English, and she's having to deal with young people bringing in essays that are all AI, but she has trained herself that she can recognize it. And I think AI is going to be very beneficial in so many different fields, but we must never lose the written word. And relationships, one with another, conversation is so valuable. And I'm old fashioned. I've done the diligence, and I know some of you have, of work, and trying to get the facts. And I'm just very nervous about losing some of that. And you have to be careful about your sources. You can't just go on the internet and know that it's legit. So I would say caution. And sometimes you have to do the hard work of going to the original primary sources.
Yeah.
And
Sarah, go ahead.
To your question, I think that also what I said earlier about how it's the facts, but it's more than that. If you want to write historical fiction, it's much more than that. You can take one fact, one event in history, and then do all kinds of research about the context around it so that you understand the people and you understand the emotions and you understand the heart. And so it's digging actually more into that human aspect of it that AI can't ever touch because it's human. And that's what historical fiction, the fiction is sort of the lightning there, in a bottle, in that you want to dig into that. And also, I think as a writer, if this helps, I am very sensorial. I go to all the places that are in my book. So in this book, it's North Carolina, Malibu, Rome, and the Benedictine Abbey in Bethlehem, Connecticut. And I went to all those places because AI, again, can't tell me what it smells like by the ocean, can't tell me what it feels like when the whole Abbey of Nuns starts singing and the walls start shaking a little. Like those things that give you goosebumps when you read about because you're experiencing them in your imagination. AI can't do that. So that's your job as a reader, or as a researcher and writer, is to dig up that gold, that human gold.
Yeah. Okay.
That helps.
Go ahead and with your question.
Thank you. I'm interested in the tension that at least a couple of you talked about between writing straight up history with 400 footnotes and making that story come alive by making stuff up and turning it into fiction. And have you ever thought about, or is it a terrible idea to try to do both of those in one book, where there is a history and then there is a parallel, here's what might have happened? And what do you think about that?
Well, I sort of did that in my book, because my first book, Suffer and Grow Strong, is the biography of Ella Gertrude Clanton Thomas, where I studied her journal of 41 years and her scrapbooks of 15 volumes and the court records and all that. And then I just put that aside. And then when I started writing this book, I didn't look at that other book because I had incorporated so much of that into my mind. And it was a great luxury to have that all stowed away. And then I could write. And I love what Geraldine Brooks said. You all know her and her great book, Horse, that we all love. She was a journalist, and she started out getting the facts. And she said, you get so much research that you feel like you could say more, but you can't. You're being held back by the footnotes, and you've got to say precisely what you know. But when you write fiction, and this is what I did in Trudy's Awakening, you get to take what you know and let your imagination take over. And she said you can go to the edge of the cliff as a nonfiction writer, and then as a fiction writer, you can jump off. I love that. And that really helped me to use my imagination more. It's a combination of both. So I think that's what I do. And you've got to get your historical material correct, because if you don't, your readers will point it out.
Yeah.
You didn't have a streetcar that year. You didn't have street lights, and Peachtree Street wasn't where it was, and that battle wasn't fun. But so far, so good.
Okay. Did you want to say something else on that, Kristina?
Sure. Yeah. I'll just add to it and say that I think that one of the struggles we have as historical fiction or as fiction authors is figuring out what serves the story and what not is just sort of a fun fact. We go, oh, this is so cool. I've got to find a way to weave it in. And if it doesn't serve the story, that's the things. I think that's the difference. That's the stuff that you have to kind of go, oh, okay, kill the darlings. I remember with my debut, Letters from Home, having a soldier, and he's in Foxhole writing a letter, and I'm like, 2 a.m. It's fascinating research, as you're going down the rabbit hole at 2 a.m. and figuring out what is the history of pens? Were there ballpoint pens? When did those come out? Do they dip it in? At 4 a.m, you're like, this is fascinating. I'm so smart about pens. And then you realize, well, I could just call it a pen. And that was kind of dumb. And then even more dumb than that is that fast forward about 2 years later when the book was published and a book club member raised her hand and she said, I'm sorry to ask this, but why didn't you just give him a pencil? I didn't like her very much, but she's not wrong. And so I think that's the thing that we get caught up with. And I think that's the difference is you kind of go, okay, what serves the story? And that's also where author's notes come in. That's our director's commentary. And that is really fun to be able to point things out that maybe we had to cut, or the things that we didn't get to squeeze in there that are so interesting that we want people to know, but it doesn't have a place in that story. Okay.
Can I add just one thing? I know we're on time. I suspect that you're starting off and working in that way. And I would say I write my novels. I have tons of footnotes while I'm working. It's all my historical stuff. I delve into footnotes as a former academic, and then it gradually moves its way into the story, what I can use and what I can't. So I think you're on the right track. It's just a matter of where you're going to wind up landing. And if you decide to keep them both, be a genre buster. Maybe somebody will be interested in it.
Yeah. Okay. We have another question. Come on up.
Thank you. That was very good. First of all, I wanted to say that the gouging story gives new meaning to the phrase keeping an eye out. I couldn't resist. On to the question. We heard about Christine's ancestors' letters inspiring her. And I was wondering if any of the rest of you, so this question is for the rest of you, have you ever read any journals, letters, diaries that you just can't resist someday in the future maybe putting to fiction?
I'm working right now on a new project that's coming partly from letters, not diaries, but yes, it's a story of a woman in the middle of revolutionary Rhode Island who, again, a theme of mine, woke up one morning and decided that she'd been called to preach. But not only did she decide she'd been called to preach, she decided that she had died overnight and the Holy Spirit had told her that she was no longer a man or a woman, but was instead a messenger called the public universal friend sent to preach the end of days. And this individual went on for 40 years and founded the first settlement in Western New York. And it all comes about through letters to her and her community. So I can't wait to get my hands on those now.
Anybody else with letters?
Oh,
Go ahead, Sarah.
I think I already mentioned that this whole book idea came about from my own pen pal relationship with Mother Dolores Hart. So those are based on letters between us, and letters are in all of, well, I look at her because I've known her so long. I'm like, I've used letters in all my work, just about, to some extent, either in the research or having the characters actually write a letter that's in there. So hugely important, hugely influential, and, beautiful pieces of primary source.
Carolyn?
I was just going to say that if you write about women in the 19th century and earlier, women were supposed to be in the background. Women were supposed to be silent. Women didn't want to be in the newspaper. They didn't want their pictures made, very unlike today, where everybody wants to have their pictures made and be in the paper. And if you wanted to know about a woman, you had to read her letters or her diary. And as I mentioned earlier, the woman that I have spent my life studying kept a journal for 41 years, on and off. And that's what women did in the 19th century. It was very commonplace for women to keep journals. And I always say, counselors tell us today, when you're going through something horrible, write it out, cry it out, talk it out. These women were doing therapy and they didn't know it by writing in their journals and expressing their emotions. And it was an outlet that they didn't have. And if you have someone like my woman who didn't plan to ever publish her diary, she thought she was writing it for her daughters. It is so honest and so heart-wrenching at times, that you can find great material.
Can I just add to that if you are a writer in the room, write journals and diaries now. I do. This isn't something that women from 100 million years ago, whenever did. Do it now. Do it now and think of that tie between us now and the past. Now there's something magical and there's an alchemy there. So
it's
right.
It's still good therapy.
Yeah. Write journals and diaries. Oh, like I said, I do it every day.
All right, we have one.
Thank you.
Hopefully we can get one more quick question in.
Okay. I just have to point out that we do not write letters anymore. And that is a real tragedy. We write emails and texts. That disappear. And my husband and I found out recently when our basement flooded and there was a trunk full of letters.
A library of grace you have.
How wonderful they were, but we really don't write letters the way people used to write letters. And I would just make a pitch for, write it on paper, whether it's typed or written or whatever, just not in a text.
That's how I met my Mother Dolores. I just sat down and wrote her a handwritten letter on notebook paper that means simple as that. Doesn't have to be fancy, doesn't have to be papyrus cards. You can do anything you want. Just write it and send it to somebody you love or someone you don't know, a complete stranger in a cloistered nunnery. So, whatever.
Okay.
Great.
Amy, do we need to say any other closing remarks before we end?
The only closing remark is that books are available. Our bookseller, it is Kara's Books, and our authors will be in the signing line right outside the door.
All right, everyone. Thank Sarah,
Thank you.
Kristina, Carolyn, and Stacia. Thanks, everybody, for coming out, and have a great rest of the day at the Decatur Book Festival.